Welcome to Exchanging Notes. This evening I have the privilege of conversing with Kenneth Oppel. Kenneth is the most prolific author I've ever interviewed, with more than 32 books to his record. He is also the recipient of the Governor General's Literary Award, the Michael L. Prince Honor Book Award. His young adult novel, Half Brother, won the Canadian Library Association Book of the Year Award for young adults and also for children, which is the first time that has been accomplished. The Nest received the Canadian Library Association's Book of the Year Award and was a New York Times Editor's Choice. This evening we are going to be talking about all of his books, in which he addresses pretty much every issue that can be addressed. And he will also tell you never before heard stuff about his life and his craft. How was that, Mike?
I can't possibly live up to that. I've said everything anyway, already.
Thank you for dropping in.
I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Let's go back right to the beginning, the misty reaches of the 20th century. You were born in 1967.
Yeah. Yes.
In Port Alberni, Port Alberni, BC.
Mm-hmm.
You grew up in Victoria and then moved to Halifax when you were about 6. Tell me about your childhood. Of all the places you've lived, which place stays with you most? What are the memories you have of that place that define your childhood for you?
Overall, I'd say it was a pretty boring suburban childhood. I think when I look back on it all, I think one of the reasons I became a writer is my own childhood was pretty boring, and I had to invent sort of more interesting stories for myself, and that was all internal. And I liked making up stories. I started writing things down from an early age. I think my favorite childhood place, we were talking earlier, was Halifax, just because it was such an interesting historical place. I liked being on the sea. I was on the sea before in Victoria, British Columbia, but Halifax just seemed to have a lot more sort of historical cargo and atmosphere. I liked the old stone. I liked the ships. I liked its maritime sort of history. I liked all the ghost stories. Mm-hmm. And we had relatives out there who would tell me terrifying ghost stories involving, haunted lighthouses and forerunners and people knocking on the door in the middle of the night. So things like that certainly stayed with me and aided and abetted my later Gothic imagination, I guess.
Now, you mentioned, we were talking, you said your father was going to school in Halifax at Dalhousie,
right,
taking a law degree in his 30s.
Yes.
How many children did he have at that time?
Just the two, me and my brother. Yeah.
And you went back to school?
Yep.
Really?
Yep. It was, I didn't think anything of it at the time. It was my family. That was just what we did. But of course, for me, I was just concerned about being moved. I didn't want to move from Victoria. I liked Victoria. I don't think any kid really likes being moved at 7, because you've got your friends in your school and stuff. So we compared Halifax very unfavorably to Victoria for a long time. And it's only in retrospect, I think, that Halifax actually was pretty much like the best 4 years of my childhood.
Now, your father, did he end up practicing law? And what sort of law did he practice?
Yeah, just general. He had a general practice back in Victoria for many years.
Your mother, what were her occupations, her interests?
She was a painter,
Really?
But in those days, she, growing up in a pretty small community on Vancouver Island, 60s and 70s, she was a stealth painter. It wasn't a proper occupation. She was expected, really to be, I think, our mother and a housewife, because they came from, my dad and mom came from pretty religious communities. So she didn't go back to university till I was in high school and got her BFA and proceeded to do, much more interesting art than she had, been able to do before, and she exhibited and I think found more fulfillment.
That's a commonality between them, isn't it, though? They both sort of made changes later than expected.
Yeah.
So they were risk-taking people.
Yeah. I think they were very much, given their backgrounds. It was not, where they came from, that was not a common trajectory at all.
Now, as a child, were you a loner or were you social?
Both. I had a small group of close friends, but I was just as happy, reading on my own or writing or imagining my next Dungeons and Dragons, campaign that I would create. That was a big part of my childhood, Dungeons and Dragons. So yeah, no, I think I was fairly, pretty typical, I think.
Who were the authors you were attracted to as a child?
Oh, wow. Well, back in the golden age of childhood, which I sort of class as 8 to 12, like Roald Dahl. Before then, Enid Blyton. People who wrote series books like the Great Brain books or the Mad Scientist Club. I liked books about kids who had clubs and did things quite independently of their parents. So they had a lot of agency. Parents were always a hindrance in children's literature. And I still think that's true. If you have too many parents in your book, there's too much sort of authority over the kids, and they don't get to do their stuff.
How about Encyclopedia Brown?
I dabbled. I couldn't get into them. I think they were too procedural to me. And I always felt dumb at the end because I could never solve the problem. So I just felt stupid.
They would have that thing where they make you figure out the solution.
Yeah, I didn't appreciate that.
Yeah.
I didn't like that part.
Now, your first book is well known for the manner in which it was acquired, as well as for doing quite well. Published in 1985, Colin's Fantastic Video Adventure. You forwarded the manuscript to a friend who forwarded it to Roald Dahl, who recommended it to his agent. You had to have success because you were doing a degree in cinema studies in English and no money was coming that way.
Yeah, I know you're ironic when you say that. Yeah.
Well, almost. I'm being ironic, I think. Why that book at that time?
Why did I write that book? I wrote that book over 2 summers when I was still in high school, when I was 14 and 15. And the first time I wrote it, it was really a short novel. I didn't really know what I was doing, so I wrote this 50-page story. And I thought it was pretty good. It was about a kid who discovers another world, inside a video game. And I sent it out to a whole bunch of publishers in Canada, and they all rejected it. Some wrote nice rejections, but they were all rejections nonetheless. And that was disappointing. But the next summer I decided to rewrite it, and it grew from 50 to 100 pages, which right away was just a more professional length. It was like a short children's novel. And I thought I'd improved it quite a lot. And that's the manuscript that I sent through a family friend, to Roald Dahl. And he read it. He was kind enough to look at it and, I don't know if he read the whole thing or skimmed it, but he saw some potential in it, and he showed it to his literary agent, and they took me on as a client and subsequently sold it. So that all happened when I was still in high school, and it came out just as I was graduating. So I went to university all puffed up and proud and insufferable, calling myself a published author with this tiny little paperback book to my credit.
Had you attempted fiction before that, short stories or other novels?
Yeah, not novels, but short stories. When I played a lot of Dungeons and Dragons, so I started writing sort of fantasy, very high fantasy sword and sorcery stories. And I would submit them to Dragon Magazine, which was the official organ of the role-playing gamester. It always had covers with, people with swords and big pecs and abs and.
What attracted you to Dungeons and Dragons? That was, the feeling of it, or the view of it generally, is that that's what the geeks do. The antisocial kids who can't find friends, they play Dungeons and Dragons.
Absolutely.
Was that sort of that sense of community you had, and that sense of assuming an identity?
Yes to everything. It was the only game I played that was a lot like a story. Playing the game was participating in a fiction that you helped create if you were a player, and designed if you were the dungeon master.
Yeah.
So the act of writing the adventure that the players were going to be on was very much like writing fiction in my mind. So I gravitated towards being a dungeon master. The game became frustrating because it involved having to have a certain number of people present to actually play the game, and everyone would flake out. It always started well. You'd have 4 keen people. And they're going, we're going to play this thing to the finish. But it's a long game. It goes on and on over many nights and weeks or whatever. And people would, drop out or say, I'm busy, I'm going to a movie, I've got swim practice. So I got impatient, and I think I started writing stories just to, for my own imaginative sort of health. I wanted to imagine what happened next in the story. Can
you give us a typical plot line of one of these stories?
Oh, the early ones were terrible. They were basically transcriptions of the game. Like the game we were playing, and you had your thief and your fighter and your cleric and your magic user, and there'd be, they'd encounter monsters, and maybe they'd do something clever to overcome something. So I would literally transcribe the game we were playing. And then, when I ran out of game to transcribe, I just have to invent new stuff. So in a way, I was writing what would now be called fan fiction, and just using it as a springboard to continue or write original material.
Well, I don't know if this question is still relevant then, but when you were working on your first book, were there other books you looked to or other authors you looked to as models?
Yeah, always. I mean, it was usually like a book like James and the Giant Peach, or Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, or Mordecai Richler's Jacob Tutu Meets the Hooded Fang. I really liked that book a lot as a kid.
For what reasons?
I mean, it's about this kid who just gets thrown in jail, basically, and it's like a dungeon, and he has to sort of get together and form an escape plan and thwart this evil, the guard that he's the Hooded Fang, who's like a wrestling star. I like the fantastical element of it, and I like the humor, the humor, and it wasn't too scary. It was just sort of a pleasing combination of elements for like a 7 or 8 year old.
Do you see an evolution in young adult and children's fiction in the 30 years you've been doing it? Are there trends in young adult fiction today that kind of trouble you in some way, or trends that make you feel good?
Well, that's a huge question. I mean, I've been sort of doing it for 30 years. So yeah, of course it's changed. Everything's changed, and compared to 30 years ago. I mean, when I was starting out, there really wasn't a ton of Canadian children's literature being written. Like, you could probably count on both hands the number of recognizable writers who were regularly publishing in Canada with Canadian houses. Most of the stuff that I grew up on was written, in England or in the United States. So as Canadians, we're sort of, we're adept at being sort of, having a foot on either side of the Atlantic and straddling the border. And we're still kind of like that, although less so in terms of our literature. So I grew up reading, stuff mostly written outside the borders. So big changes. We have a lot more people writing in Canada. And the trends and the subdivisions of what the children's genre have just become much more rigid. I mean, in the old days, I'm going to call 30 years ago the old days. In the old days, if you published a children's book, you'd be publishing to an audience that you assume might be sort of, unless you're writing picture books for very small kids, from 7-year-olds to maybe 13-year-olds. And beyond 13, like, people just read adult books. When people were finished reading children's books when I was young, you just started reading like Stephen King or Danielle Steele or someone like that. You just went into sort of popular, more commercial adult fiction. But now there's the whole YA genre, which is supposed to take you from 13 up to 25. That's the demographics of the people who read the Twilights and the Hunger Games and the John Greens and things like that. And that really didn't exist when I was starting out. So there's a young adult market. There's now middle grade. So what I write mostly, these would now fall into what's called middle grade, which is for 8 to 12-year-olds. And then there's sort of an early chapter book before then, and then the picture books, which are for like infants, books to be read to, or books that are read to them. And the trends have changed. I mean, is in accelerating cycles. I think over the time I've been writing. I mean, I remember Goosebumps, Babysitter's Club, Magic Treehouse, R.L. Stine. Yeah, the Goose is huge. I mean, these were things that were so huge at the time you couldn't imagine anything huger. You couldn't imagine anyone selling more books than R.L. Stine or more books than the Babysitter's Club. And then, along would come Harry Potter. And then no one could imagine anyone selling more books, in that genre. And everyone wrote, a lot more people were writing fantasy. So, it was more like the movie business. The trends would follow the biggest blockbuster. So you had the Harry Potter blockbuster, and then you had the Twilight juggernaut, and then you had the Hunger Games juggernaut, and now you have sort of the John Green juggernaut. Now, I don't know what we're on now. I've lost track. But like anything, the cycles, the fad cycles are becoming faster and faster.
Do you look to the current trends when you're deciding what project to work on? I've got the feeling that you don't sit around for a long time deciding what to do next. You decide very quickly and you get on with it. How do you make that decision?
Well, I mean, a lot of the ideas that I write have been sort of simmering in my notebooks for up to 10 years. And when I finish a project, I go back and look at the contenders for what I want to write next. And some of those ideas, just aren't ready yet. And I'll write some more notes, and then I'll just put them away and start something else. So I try not to follow fads because I think there's nothing sadder than trying to chase a trend for a whole bunch of reasons. One is you're sort of trying to second guess yourself and trying to chase something rather than doing what you're most excited about or what you think is your best work. And also, the chances are, if you're chasing a trend, you're going to end up writing a book, and if you're lucky enough to get it published, it's probably going to come at the tail end of the trend, because something else will have happened, and a seismic shift will have occurred, and you'll just be this sort of like, you kind of missed the boat. And that's only happened to me once. I've only once been aware of chasing a trend, and that, I don't regret it, because I was happy with the way the book turned out. But I did feel like I missed the boat on that one.
I get the feeling that a character you really like is Giles Barnes of the Barnes and the Brains series. He's the one who makes me think of Encyclopedia Brown.
Right.
Where did his character come from?
Yeah.
And of all the protagonists you've created, which ones are your favorites and why? What did you learn from them as they became people in the process of creation?
You know how many books I've written, right?
32
There's a lot
or
of characters.
33, yeah.
It's funny you mentioned Giles Barnes, because I mean that was a character I cooked up early in my career for a series of short chapter books for beginning readers. And those were books, I hate to say it, but they were books that were sort of born in a healthy dollop for financial reasons, because I was just starting my career and I'd just gotten married. I just moved to England with my wife, who was doing her PhD, and we were penurious. We had no money, and I wanted to make some money writing. And my agent said, why don't you try these short chapter books? I think you can do them pretty quickly, and I think I can find a publisher for them. So they were like writing sort of short stories, more like short stories, but they would be published individually with lots of illustrations. So I really liked doing it. It was a lot of fun, and there were 6 of them, in the end. But those books were very much me being nostalgic about, the Mad Scientist Club books or the Great Brain books. Just kids, 3 kids who ran a genius business, and weird things would happen in the neighborhood, and people would come and hire them to solve their problems. So they were fun to write, but they were not really typical of what I'd later go on to do.
Do your protagonists usually come to you pretty well formed, or do you have to suss them out and construct them and think about them for a while?
It's both for me. I mean, I tend to start with a story or a premise first. Okay. So I know a lot of writers, they have this compelling character in their head, or a voice, the way someone sounds. And that can be an amazing, galvanizing incident as a writer, just to have this notion of this person and their voice. That sometimes happens to me, but it usually happens after I've thought of a great premise or a setting for a book or a conflict or some kind of quest. And then I get to work thinking about, well, who's the best person to inject into this story or to experience the events that I see happening. So I kind of work, I don't know if it's backwards or the wrong way. I always assume I'm doing it wrong, no matter how many books I've written. But it's just my own way of approaching the project.
Your 3 multiple title series, Silver Wing, Airborne, Barnes and the Brains. I'm going to get a bit analytical here, but Airborne is about freedom. Silver Wing is about exile, which is the dark side of freedom. Barnes and the Brains is about being an outcast but being accepted. There's that sense of that you keep going to in your books, that sense of the relationship of the individual to the group that seems to tie together a lot of your books. Is that a conscious thing?
No, because I'm hearing this for the first time.
Is it valid?
Sure, everything's valid. I mean, it's funny, you say when you write a book, the story is a very specific thing for me and the characters in it and what it means. But you realize when people read it, they have, completely different or pick out things, and it means that's the great thing about a book. It's like, wouldn't it be terrible if everyone who read the same book had exactly the same reaction to it and found the same things? I mean, that would be an incredibly boring thing about human beings if we all had the same reaction to that movie or that book. But we bring ourselves, to every book we read or every, film or, television program we watch. So we sort of participate in what we think the book is about. I try and avoid getting too analytical about, because from time to time I have heard papers delivered about my, oeuvre,
really?
or my body of
Your
work.
canon.
And it's often quite, it's fascinating and often quite flattering. And I feel like I'm really smart, but honestly, like I don't. It's sort of counterproductive to I find like creating a fictional world, having this sort of analytical or editorial voice in my head, sort of saying, "Oh, you've done this before, I think," or "This relationship reminds me of that relationship."
Yeah.
Because yeah.
Are you saying then with a tetralogy like Silverwing or a trilogy like Airborne, there's no reason why there are so many books? They just kind of happened?
Yes, they are. And those examples very much. I didn't plan them as a series. I wrote one at a time. I had no big story arc because I find that too daunting. Like I can't understand how people can plan like a 3-book series or a 7-book series or a 13-book series. I can't think that far ahead. So I always waited until I had what I thought was a good standalone idea before I embarked on it. And really, I think that's the healthiest way to do it for me, anyway. Because then you write a nice self-contained story that doesn't require you have to read the first one or the second one or the third one. They stand alone. I think books should stand alone.
Your only adult fiction was The Devil's Cure in 2000, a tale of science and religion, rationalism and faith. A cult leader escapes from prison. He has the cure to cancer in his blood, but he's not going to give it away. And I find it a really interesting book, if you'll pardon my being analytical.
No, go ahead.
Because the character is an adult who's a solipsist. His world is himself. And children tend to be solipsists when they're growing up, but are taught and in culture to think of the group. So it seems like you're almost doing the flip side of your children's books. You're doing a child as an adult.
This is great.
Yeah?
I'm really enjoying this.
Are you taking notes?
Yeah. Let me get my phone out.
This is on video.
Yeah, I mean, solipsistic in Devil's Cure, I mean, he's a member. He's not the leader, I don't think. He's a member of the cult.
Okay.
So his view is very, I mean, by a secular viewpoint, it's very circumscribed and sort of self-referential. But he's, I don't know if I'd call him solipsistic. I'd call him incredibly zealous. He's more of a zealot. Not narcissistic. I don't think so. No, I don't. I mean, I think he sees the big picture. He sees himself as like just a vessel, really.
Yeah.
In the greater service of what he imagines to be his God.
Now, you're probably going to say no, but I'll ask anyway because it's written down here.
Okay.
Why this book at this time? Why in 2000 did you write an adult book?
Oh, all sorts of terrible reasons, really. One of the things I also did as a writer, especially early in my career, was write screenplays.
Really?
And I had a reasonable amount of success optioning them to producers in Los Angeles and Toronto, and I made quite a good income at it for a number of years. And Devil's Cure was based on a script I'd written that was optioned and never produced. And I just liked the idea. I thought it was a shame to waste a good idea. And I hadn't written an adult book yet. I'd written, I think I was sort of halfway through my Silverwing books, which were really the first books that got me any attention and a readership. Yeah. And I just thought, it was in a way a very prideful decision. I just thought, I want to prove I can write a book for grown-ups too. And so I found an agent who was all enthusiastic about the idea, and he was going to mentor me, and he was Ken Follett's agent. He was going to make me a huge blockbuster bestseller, and he was grooming me, and I worked on this novel, and I became more and more miserable.
Really?
As I wrote,
Why?
It wasn't any fun. It wasn't as much fun as writing a kid's book, just because I felt like there was so much. I felt like someone was like a big grown-up was watching me over my shoulder as I wrote.
Yeah.
With not that kids you can slip stuff by or be sloppy or shoddy. It's just that there's more sense of permission and wonder in a children's book. And with the kind of book I was writing, which book that I never read. Like I never read medical thrillers, and I was attempting to write a medical thriller, and I had to do all this research into cancer research and T cells and genetic engineering and religious cults and the FBI in Chicago, and it was set in Chicago, and none of that had anything to do with me, and I wasn't that interested in any of it really. But I was very diligent, and I wrote the book, and I got published in a whole bunch of countries. I was well paid for it, but by the end, I didn't enjoy the experience. And it sort of showed me this is not really the kind of writing, A, I'm best at, and two, that I enjoy doing.
It makes it seem that children or adults are just children with baggage, and perhaps an adult book is just a children's book with a few more ideas thrown in, you know?
I don't even know if it's that. I've struggled with because people always ask, what's the difference between writing for adults and writing for children? And I don't really feel I've written enough for adults to answer that authoritatively or wisely. But I just really think it has more to do with what your focus as a writer, whether you're more interested in whose story you're most interested in telling. And I think that one of the main differences between writing for adults and writing for kids, because there's lots of writing for adults that has a child hero, from Huck Finn to Catcher in the Rye to Donna Tartt's Goldfinch. It's about how much commentary you're providing around the character. Mm-hmm. You can provide all this clever commentary and exposition based on an adult point of view. But when you're writing for kids, kids are living, in the present tense. It's now, and you want to write in this as if you're in the skin of a kid, and you're looking out through the kid's eyes. And kids are not going to philosophize. They're not going to talk about, in retrospect, what I did at that moment. There's no future tense in a kid's book. It's all happening, now. And so I think that's the trick of if you can write for kids, you really got to inject yourself into this, perpetual present tense of being a kid. That's my take on it.
It struck me that an Inkling, which I think is 2018 or 2017?
Yeah, it's like 3 months ago,
that you were discussing that. You were talking about making the words true in one section of that. Do you remember that?
In the book?
In Inkling, yeah.
Making the words true.
I've got notes on that somewhere.
Okay.
I can't really, but...
You may have to jog my memory.
Yeah.
Give me a little more.
Let's ask about something most important, the craft of writing.
Okay.
33 years since your first book, 32 books later. What are some of the important things you know about writing now that you didn't know then?
I think the most important thing I've learned over the years about writing is ideally you give yourself permission to write badly, and especially in the first draft. Because even after 32 books, I'm not sure it gets easier. I'm more practiced at it. I've learned more tricks to keep myself writing. But for every book, you're starting from nothing. And the first draft for me it's a horrible thing. It's hard to write. I have this beautiful shiny idea, but getting it down on paper I find really very difficult. And I want it to be perfect the first time. I think that's a pretty common impulse from kids on up. And it's never going to be perfect the first time. So for me, I think the smartest thing I've learned is just write the first draft. Let it be as terrible as it needs to be. Don't try and edit or second guess yourself. Just write it. And the amazing thing about writing is when you're in the act of writing, even if you know you're writing a terrible sentence and a terrible paragraph, at some point you'll write a good sentence, and at some point you'll have an idea for what might happen in the scene or where the story might be going. And you wouldn't have had those ideas or that revelation unless you're actually in the physical act of writing. That's the one thing I've learned over the years. Like I'm a big planner. When I start a book, I have outlines, and I've spent a lot of time thinking about the book. But the really good stuff often comes when you're in the act of writing. So you have to actually force yourself to give yourself permission to just write without trying to beat yourself up and make sure it's right as it goes down on the page.
Feel free to be bad.
Sure, that's a good tagline. Yeah.
What is your routine as a writer? Is it quantity? Is it time?
When I'm writing a book, like when I'm in the midst of it, I try and write 1,000 words a day.
Really?
And
How long does that take you?
It could take me half an hour. It could not happen after 7 hours. So it varies from day to day, but it's good to have a goal. And those words might be awful. They might be rubbish, and I'll just end up getting rid of them. But at least at the end of the day you thought, I did this. I did something. Yeah. And something will come of it.
And your family is knocking on the door going, how many words? We're having dinner.
They
how
don't
many words?
No. My work is very unmysterious and not of huge interest. I mean, it's all I've ever done. So my kids have grown up knowing what I do, and my wife has lived with me long enough to. There's no mystery left in being a writer. There's no mystique. not in one's own home.
Do you have an established beginning to end process, or is it something you make up anew with each book?
It's become quite similar over the years. I mean, I try and write that really hard first draft. And what I do more and more now is if I get stuck while writing, I used to go back and rewrite. Now I don't bother with that anymore. I just jump ahead. If there's a part in the story that I'm excited about and think will make a great scene, I just jump ahead and write it. And the great thing is if you write this scene that and it's really good, it might give you a clue on what needs to happen to earn that scene. So, you might figure out how to get unstuck back here by writing, in the future of the story. You're saying, what would need to happen for this amazing event to take place? So I sort of write often all out of order, and in the end I have this sort of patchwork quilt of scenes, and I sort of like suture it all together. It's an ugly thing.
And an outline that's been altered innumerable times, I guess.
Yeah. Yep. The outline it's like a constant work in progress. It's good to get the ball rolling, but as you start to write, then it'll change.
Let's talk about sentences. You've written a lot of sentences.
Yes.
What is a good sentence? How does it work by itself and in conjunction with other sentences?
Well, everyone will have a different answer to that. I mean, I'm a novel. I think of myself as a novelist. So I feel like the imperative of the novelist is to tell a story in the most effective way possible. So I feel like the writing should serve the story and the characters. I'm not. I love good writing, but I like writing that surprises me, but that doesn't. It's not too self-conscious. It's not too labored. It's not showing off. It's not pulling the reader out of the story by startling you with its ingenuity. So that's how I approach a sentence. It's a very simple thing.
Did it take you a long time to reach that point? Usually, writers start off trying to be writers, and they end up with something that's flowery and overwrought, and learn to scale back later.
I mean, I think there's as many prose styles as grains of sand. People respond to certain types of sentences, and just the ones that I like are just ones that are like a writer like the British writer. I don't know if any of you know Ian McEwan, the British writer. He's sort of like he writes sort of literary thrillers. They're sort of often quite thinky, but they're also really athletic and kinetic. And his writing is just perfect. It's really erudite, but it's not difficult to fathom or obscure. But he just sort of gets the job done with his sentences in a very sort of, I think, robust way.
When you look back at your work, do you see different preoccupations, philosophic concerns, thematic concerns recurring or progressing? I wanted to ask you particularly about the Live Forever machine, where you say there are machines that have to be seen to be believed. You can't imagine the power. And then Deadwater Zone begins. Paul dreamed machinery. Machinery seems to be important to you.
I like machinery, metaphorically too.
Yeah.
I think that was my Blade Runner stage. I like I like the look of machinery, and I like all those moving parts. I like big vehicles. I like trains and airships and sort of these sort of mechanical wonders. Sort of almost the more outlandish, the better. I don't know. What is it about machinery? I guess I've always been interested in machinery as a sort of analogy to humans. Like the great thing about the movie Blade Runner, which is my favorite movie, and I feel like I've tried to create something as good as Blade Runner all my career is that when you have machines and robots, the interesting thing about a robot is it makes you define like what it is what is a human, just by contrast to the robot. So if you have a robot, you're a cyborg or a replicant, you say, well, why isn't it human? What's it missing? And then you ask yourselves, well, aren't we as humans missing that sometimes? So it becomes very interesting. It's sort of a monster in man. It's a Frankenstein question, and that's another one of my favorite books. So I guess I just find that that relationship between the creator and the creation quite interesting. I mean, it's religious too. It's moral. It's everything.
Maybe also the way that machinery enables people. I mean, in Boundless, for example, the train is the device that contains the plot.
Yeah, it literally is. It's both the the setting and also the sort of the mechanism of the plot. This thing on tracks that's hurtling along. I often thought if I couldn't write, like I might be able to invent a really good theme park ride. So
Have you come up with any yet?
No, I'm keeping,
No?
in case I flame out as a writer, I'm keeping theme park designer in my pocket.
Well, you must remember that you have all those plot ideas on the back burner, which I would like to return to.
Sure.
What is the most outlandish plot you've ever come out with where you said, no, this is too outlandish, I can't use this yet? Or something that you've tried to make work but couldn't quite?
Well, if it was that good, I would have used it or tried to use it. I wouldn't leave it unused. But I mean, probably the hardest one for me to figure out how to work was The Nest, because it's such an odd story about a wasp nest that's incubating and growing a human baby that's meant to replace a sick baby in a house, and the hero is communicating with this sort of wasp queen inside the nest, and my hero has to do is say yes for this perfect baby growing in the wasp nest to be swapped with his sick baby brother. And I had elements of that idea kicking around in my head for a long time before I figured out how to sort of put them all together and who the main character would be and the point of view of the story. And then it came very fast. It had been simmering for 10 years, and then it all came in sort of 6 weeks. But for a long time, it didn't seem I'd be able to figure out how to, make that machine work, how all the cogs would fit together.
Is that unusual for you to have something just sort of cooking away for 10 years, or does that happen?
It used to be unusual. Now it's more common.
Really?
Yeah.
Why
there used to be a shorter gestation period with my books.
Because of the pressure?
No, maybe I was just smarter then. I don't know, or maybe I don't know.
You were younger.
I was younger. Now I find like some of my best ideas are ones that have been, that have always been in my notebooks, and they've always, had that sparkle to them. So when I look back and think, what am I going to do next? It's still interesting to me after 2, 5, 10 years.
How many notebooks do you have?
Well, I used to have lots, but now sadly I do most of my notes on my phone and just email them to myself.
Yeah.
So it's not as nice. I kind of miss the physicality of the notebook, and it's nice to travel with it, but it's just more bulk. So now it's kind of disappointing.
Now, do you research your story ideas with children, and do they give you any feedback that you utilize?
Heavens, no. No. Not even my own kids. I mean,
Really?
I would read to my 2 older kids as a test audience when I had a first draft, and they could be really helpful because they vote with their bodies. You can tell when they're bored or restless, and also when they're really interested because they get really quiet and they lean closer to you. So that's very helpful. So they've done that for me. And I correct myself. Laterally, they have had ideas and dreams, which I've used in my books.
So you trust pretty implicitly that part of yourself that relates back to the child and what the child needs?
You kind of have to if you're writing for kids. I mean, it's I always think of it like this door. It's like this magical door that you keep open with your childhood. But I'm not sure it's actually like something that's receding into the background. I kind of sometimes think like our childhoods travel with us, like in this parallel river. I just think maybe I'm unusual, or maybe that's why I write children's books. The number of times in a day or week I will think of the past or something in my childhood. I just think the people who write for children are very good at sort of bridging that, the present with their past. And they're interested in the world of childhood and the experiences you have when you're a kid. It's a very exciting time. I mean, everything is new and it's fresh, and there's a lot of first-time experiences. So I think that's why a lot of people like writing for kids, because it's like this new world, open.
It's also why a lot of people go to psychiatrists. So you think your books are kind of serving that purpose of figuring out your childhood?
Maybe I don't need to see a therapist as much because I'm writing
much?
I'm writing the books that I wish I had read when I was a kid, or what I think I would have most liked to read as a kid. I think that's it.
I wanted to ask you, are you a nocturnal person?
No.
You're a day person.
Yeah.
Does night hold a certain fascination for you?
Sure. Yeah, I like the night. I like the idea of the night. I wrote a whole series of books about nocturnal creatures.
Yeah.
I mean, it comes with all these, the trappings of the Gothic, and also, it's a new world. We're such diurnal creatures. It'd be cool to think of a whole different landscape and how things look at night. So I always liked stories that took place in dark places, sewers and tunnels and caves, and a lot of that stuff's in my books too. It's all over it.
Do your parents read your books?
Yep.
What do they think of them? What have they told you?
I think they're proud of me.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think they like them. They're usually complimentary. What can they do?
What can they do?
What are they going to say?
Our little Kenneth is doing well.
Say, not as good as the last one, Ken.
They were career jumping in their late 30s, and you know who you wanted to be when you're 17. That's a reverse of a trend.
Yes, unusual.
Now that you're famous and successful, what is the process you go through when you put a book out? Inkling, for example, what is the marketing? What is the promotion? Is there an editorial process you go through?
Well, the editorial process has been the same, for every book. I mean, some books require more editing and some less. So I've had editors who have, been more robust in their suggestions and helpful, and other books where I got very little editorial feedback, and the editors seemed content to let me just go with it. But yeah, after the book is edited, there's like at least a year before it comes out, often. So I'm usually well into another book by the time the book actually does come out. So Inkling came out this fall, and I've already finished another book, and I'm halfway through a second one. But when the book comes out, if you're lucky enough to have your publisher devote marketing money to you and send you places and arrange events for you at bookstores or libraries or conferences, that's a huge plus. It doesn't happen for every writer. So I'm pretty grateful I still get a share of that attention. So when a book comes out, I can spend a month across Canada and the US just visiting schools and libraries and bookstores, doing readings and signings, and basically flogging the book. It's like you become a salesman.
You have to be a showman to do the schools. Those fourth graders, if they don't like you, they'll just...
Oh no, they are not a merciful group. But they're also great. The ones that are really terrifying are grades 8 and up.
Why is that?
Oh, just because they become so self-conscious.
Yeah.
They've lost all their sort of spontaneity and lack of self-consciousness. So they're sitting there like, I don't know, like
trying
cadavers,
like
basically.
Graders,
yeah, they're just like, they want to be entertained. They're kind of challenging you. They don't want to show that they're interested because that's uncool, or they're too keen. Everyone is so self-conscious at that age that they just basically don't want to move or do anything that might be considered askew. So I love grade 4, 5, 6s, up to 7 sometimes, because they're just like, they're totally, they're open. They'll laugh, they'll talk, they'll ask questions. So I like those guys.
Do you keep track of your international sales? Where are you selling right now?
At the second?
That is very second.
Japan and Dusseldorf.
Really?
No, Germany has always been a good market for me. I think it's a very literary sort of culture. They seem to they translate a lot of books from English into German. They have quite a robust market. So book to book it varies where a book sells around the world.
But you do well in Japan.
Well, I was joking. I've been published in Japan. I don't think my books have ever done terrifically in Japan. Yeah.
But you feel that they have, you don't seem to try to be sort of consciously Canadian. There are no things said in Timmins in your book. And it seems like your book would be open to an international audience.
I think it is easier to sell like a fantasy book or a book that's sort of set out of time or in a sort of a timeless setting elsewhere. Although I'm not sure. John Green is sold around the world. He's very site-specific, cultural-specific.
Is there a reason why you're not being geographically specific?
Mostly the stories I write don't really or necessarily require it. I mean, sometimes, a lot of them are very specific. Like The Boundless is very specific. Half Brothers set in Victoria, BC. Boundless is set, across the whole country, and it's Canada. It's unapologetically Canada.
Yeah.
It's, in a way, it's my most Canadian book, because I really wanted to try and mythologize certain things that I find interesting about Canada. And as I said earlier, having grown up at a time when there wasn't a lot of children's literature being written in Canada for Canadians, I felt like all my references were American or British. And that's a shame to me, that we haven't been able to mythologize ourselves like the Americans have or the British have. Part of it is time, part of it is the size of the population, and it'll change. But Boundless was to me, very geographically specific. Inkling could take place anywhere. Although, to me, it was Toronto.
There's that insufferable Canadian humility which forbids us to tout any geographic location. Speaking of Canada,
yes.
Tell me about Canada. Why is Canada important in the world today?
Oh, man.
Oh, man, yes.
That's not a writer question.
I know.
I can't answer that, really. I won't sound intelligent. I'm not well informed enough. Why? What was it? Why is Canada important?
What does Canada mean to you?
To me?
Yeah.
Well, it's where I've lived most of my life. It's where, all my sort of political and social parameters, I think, have really been set by being a Canadian. I like our system of sort of social democracy. I like that we have safety nets. I like that we don't live with the element of fear and uncertainty like some countries where you don't have health care or the gun laws are not as robust as we have them here. I feel like it's on the whole a fairly safe and civil society. I've lived in a couple other countries. I still like Canada the best.
What is it that draws you to Toronto?
Sheer luck, just
Really?
fluke. Yeah, I came out here for university because I wanted to try somewhere different. I wanted to live in a bigger city. And once you go to university somewhere, I find it's easy. You meet people and you form friends, and there's a lot of glue to keep you in that place. Having said that, I lived 3 years after that in England, and then Newfoundland for a couple of years, and then got back here. But it's a great place to live.
It is, yeah. Let me give you 5 minutes to speak about anything you'd like to. Do you have any sort of current projects?
Well, I am working on something. It's having earlier said I really think standalone books are the way to go. I am writing a trilogy, which is quite against my better instincts and judgment. But it was such an exciting idea. And it was, in fact, given to me by my daughter, the idea for this book, because she has amazing dreams. And I have very vivid dreams. My mother had very vivid dreams. I'm starting to wonder if vivid dreaming is hereditary or just temperamental.
Genetic?
Yeah, because there's a commonality in all my mother's dreams and my dreams, even my daughter's dreams sometimes.
What are they? What is the commonality?
I'm not going to tell you.
No?
But this is my stuff. But I've just noticed this quite fascinating thing. And anyway, my daughter was telling me about one of her dreams, and I listened, my jaw dropped, and I thought, that is an amazing scene. And very quickly, a whole plot sort of formed itself around this one scene. And then that scene turned into a novel and possibly a 3-part novel. So I'm in the middle of this big project. So yeah, it's horrible. It's always horrible writing something.
Are you writing all 3 books before you release them?
It'll almost be that way, yeah, because the first one won't come out till spring of 2020. And then the second one's 6 months later and 6 months later. So they're bringing them out very fast. So it means I have to have them pretty much all written.
Is there a title?
First one's called Bloom.
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 Is it about flowers or Leopold?
Certain types of flowers.
Ah.
Yeah. Really mean flowers.
Mean
plants.
Really?
Yeah.
Now
it's about really mean plants that strangle and melt and don't wish us well at all.
That sounds like the kind of dream a 6-year-old would have with mean flowers.
Maybe. I don't know. I can't remember. I had a lot of nightmares as a kid. So.
A lot of nightmares?
Mm-hmm.
Why?
I don't know. I just did. I was told too many scary stories.
Uh-huh.
I was foolish and even if I didn't see scary movies, I'd get my friends to tell me the plots, and then I could be scared indirectly about the scary movies.
Yeah. That's the belief in the verisimilitude of stories, I guess. Some people have more sort of sensuous reactions to narrative, and they find it an almost a physical thing. Do you agree with that? I mean, do you think that you have a stronger reaction to the printed word than a lot of other people might have?
I don't know if I do. I mean, I think we're all, our brains are sort of storytelling machines, whether we like it or not. Like, I think basically everything that happens to us, we turn into a story, whether it's a visit to the doctor or, you know, a presentation at work. I mean, we sort of form everything into these little narrative units because that makes sense to us. It just seems to be hardwired into our brain. I've spent so long thinking of stories that just seems to be stories occupy a lot of space in my brain. Yeah, and it's about all I'm good at. So it's like this is one sort of area. It's like specializing in one area. I'm kind of good at stories and thinking about stories, and quite good at anything else.
Do you have any other hobbies?
No.
That's all you
That's
do,
it.
huh?
Yeah.
Wow.
I have interests, but I don't. I'm not most of my friends have all these hobbies. I think sometimes I think I should get a hobby. They just seem really boring compared to writing or making up stories.
Compared to sitting in a room by yourself.
Yeah, just imagining stuff that might happen.
Yeah. That's fascinating. I would like to ask you for your own story, possibly your closing line.
Yeah.
This is the final question. Now, W.C. Fields proposed that his epitaph read, all things considered, I'd rather be in Philadelphia. Rodney Dangerfield's epitaph reads, there goes the neighborhood. What would you like your epitaph to read?
Oh, I know. I have the answer to that because I got a review once for my book Airborne, and it said there's a line in it that I loved because it was almost like grudging. It was almost like they almost meant it like this is not really appropriate, but they called it almost absurdly entertaining, and I love that. So that's what I want on my tombstone.
Kenneth Oppel, almost
absurdly entertaining.
Not quite.
I just like the combination of absurd, like to me, absurdly entertaining. That's pretty good. Like it's like this is crazy. This is so entertaining. I can't believe it. It's not right.
Yeah.
So that's what I want to do when I write books. I just want them to be absurdly entertaining.
Ladies and gentlemen, Kenneth Oppel, almost absurdly entertaining.
Almost. Yeah.
Thank you for coming out.
Oh, thank you. It was fun.
We have
good
time
to have a
for questions. Does anybody have a question?
Yeah. Oh. Yeah.
I'll just give you a mic.
I'm curious about your experiences with the translating, in terms of that process, in terms of how it is that you were involved, and or what it is that you use to kind of vet whether or not the
It's a
essence
good translation
or the integrity is being maintained or guarded or pursued in that process.
Well, it's not a very satisfying answer for you, but it's like those things are usually taken right out of my hands because if I'm lucky enough to have a book published in another country and translated, that sale is arranged by my agent, and the publisher finds a translator, and they just do it without any consultation with me. So it's not like I would be very helpful, because I have very clumsy French and German, but I would not know, what was a good translation or not. I have never attempted to read any of my books in translation. Sometimes a very diligent translator, and I've had this from a Japanese translator and maybe one other, a German or maybe a French, where they'll send me a list of questions, usually about an idiom or a phrase that is just, puzzling. And they really want to make sure they understand the sense of what I was trying to get across. And I appreciate that as a writer, because they don't need to consult me. They could just wing it and do their own thing. So it's really, as a writer, you just sort of take it on faith that they found, an accomplished person. And I'm assuming to be able to translate something is not just being fluent. It's like a whole other level of expertise and almost, a writerly expertise that would enable you to take something from another language and take it and transcribe it.
Anyone else?
I was just wondering if you had to get your daughter's, or you felt you had to get your daughter's permission to elaborate on her dream.
Yeah, I guess properly I should. She's given me her blessing. She was happy for me to use that dream. And really, come on. I mean, it's just like one idea. It's like a 2-minute scene in what's going to be a huge blockbuster movie. How much credit does she deserve? Not that much. You know, she shouldn't get ahead of herself.
So I was wondering if anything changed in your process throughout the years, because you've been doing this for like 30 odd years, like what times you wrote, how many hours you wrote, and obviously that could be determined by circumstance, whether you have as much time as you used to, and how you manage to adapt to the changing circumstances or your own changing writing process.
I feel like I've been really lucky because really for about 20 years I've been able to treat it like a 9-to-5 job. So I've had the luxury of, you know, a 7 or 8 hour work day, you know, maybe with a, you know, hiatus for lunch where I, you know, bring my kids home and help make them lunch and then kick them off back to school. So I feel like I've always had a pretty generous work schedule. If anything, I've probably gotten sloppier about using my time wisely. I mean, I've developed, as I said, you know, earlier, you know, some more tricks, you know, for keeping writing, like once I've started. So I don't waste a lot of time. You know, I don't have days where I just, you know, oh, I couldn't write. Or they're pretty rare, luckily. I have days where I'm not happy with what I've written for sure. And I feel like I've gone backwards. But really, I think probably, I don't know if it's just me or other writers would feel the same, the biggest challenge to my process is probably technology now and devices, you know, my stupid phone. And just how easy it is to get distracted. Before you had to at least try to distract yourself. You might have to get up and do the dishes or go for a walk or something that was at least interesting or useful. Now it's just with, you know, the internet and my smartphone, I can, you know, waste 5-10 minutes just, you know, on Twitter or, you know, I don't know, finding out how much a movie grossed in 1997 or, you know, what exactly, you know, this fading celebrity's up to nowadays. So, you know, it's easy to waste time. So I think the discipline that you always needed as a writer, you're going to need double now because it's just so easy to, you know, to veer off. And writing is hard for me. It's just like, you know, I kind of we always welcome distractions, but now they're just like, you know, pirouetting across the room in front of us.
Has it gotten harder over the years? Is it harder for you to finish a book now?
I've gotten faster. I mean, despite all this, I think, but I think that just might be, you know, I've trained all my writerly muscles, and I've gotten good at writing a certain type of story and a certain narrative, and getting into a rhythm. And you do get into a kind of a rhythm the more you write. Like I felt like I really only fell into it like about 15 years ago, just where like I could produce a book every sort of year and a half, you know, quite regularly. But it took like 10, 15 years to sort of figure that out.
Took you 18 years to figure out how to be a good writer.
Yeah, well, I'm still figuring it out. Yeah, it's a lifelong process. We try.
Thank you. Your book, The Nest, you said it took you about 10 years to write it?
Well,
why is that?
It was sitting around for 10 years. And I would write notes on it, and I couldn't figure out how to tell the story properly, and I'd just put it back in the drawer and write something else. But every time I finished a project, I'd go back and look at it again and think, there's something in this. And I'd maybe write some more notes, and I just wouldn't click. And then, you know, one day when I was looking at the notes, it finally clicked. I don't know what happened, you know. But obviously it works, you know. And in some ways, I think letting an idea simmer for as long as it needs is really quite a beneficial thing if you have that kind of luxury and you have something else you can work on. Because some stories just seem to have a longer gestation period in your mind. Some come together much faster. Like Inkling came together pretty fast. But The Nest, you know, it just took 10 years. For The Nest? Yes, The Nest was one of the first things, and I didn't know. I found the notes in my notebooks, and it just says The Nest, and I wrote a nest of ghosts. I think I thought I had the idea it was a ghost, kind of a ghostly story, but I just had a kind of a wish list of things I wanted to put into the story. I didn't know how they all tied together.
Hi.
Hi.
What's the most recent book that you've read that motivates you to keep writing?
Oh, that I've read. I mean, I feel like anytime I read a book, and even if I'm not crazy about the book, but I read a good sentence or a paragraph or something that startles me or shows me something about a person or shows me something I've never seen before, that fills me with a sense of like both pleasure as a reader and also admiration as a writer. And I want to know, how did they do that? What I want to deconstruct it. Like what are the parts? It's very mechanical that they created this effect with. And I think, in my case, I mean, part of why I'm a writer is there's always that sense of how exciting it is to encounter a new story and to dream one up. And the most exciting part of writing for me is just daydreaming and brainstorming, and wondering what might happen in a story. So the idea of writing the perfect story is probably what keeps me motivated. And I see glimmers of that whenever I read a good book. Yeah.
How do you know if you're overthinking an idea?
If you're worried you're overthinking it, that might be an indicator. If you're spending a lot of time wondering, am I overthinking this? I overthink things all the time in the planning stages. Scenes that probably aren't that important, you'll put this huge effort because you just want to, I want to make sure you've got it right. And sometimes the only way of knowing whether you're on the right track is to write it out that way. Like often you could reach this stage when you're writing where you think, I could write it this way or this way. I don't know which one to do. And sometimes the easiest way, and I swear probably the fastest way in the end, rather than trying to think it through and plot it all out, is just to write it that way. And you'll realize, no, that doesn't work because of X, Y, and Z. And then that's a useful thing. Even though you've got to chuck that out, you'll realize this is the better way. So sometimes it takes sort of like coming at it from a different angle. And that's why I jump around a lot in the first draft, because it gives you an idea of what you really want in the story. And if you really want these 4 things, you've got to make sure they've earned their keep and earned their place in the story. So if you get sort of hung up on one part, sometimes it's good to take the pressure off by, moving off that part, and you might get a new, some new clarity on it. I don't know.
Do you start with your ending, or do you kind of just discover it as you start writing?
I would love it if I was able to know the ending before I started. Sometimes I have a general sense of the ending. Like I before I start, I'd like to have a beginning, middle, and end, or a rough idea anyway, and all, like a whole bunch of major events or anchor points in the story. But the ending is a really tricky thing. I find endings really hard. To write a satisfying ending that doesn't seem too pat, answers all the questions, that the reader might have, and all the desires, because when we read a book, like you usually want certain things for certain characters, and you don't have to give them all those things, but you have to at least sort of have a reason for giving or not giving the characters what they want at the end of the story. So usually the ending sort of does change as you're writing the book. And it's always tense because I can be halfway through a book and still feel like, I don't know what the ending is. I can't feel the ending. I can't see it. But luckily, so far, I always get an ending in the end. But it's a tough thing to come up with. But you don't have to know it when you start to write, I don't think.
Thank you, Kenneth Oppel.
Oh, did you want? I think she had one more question there in the front.
What are your thoughts on writers' groups, and are you currently part of one?
I've never been part of a writers' group. Sometimes I think it would be great because I think you sort of can egg each other on and encourage each other, and there's sort of a social pressure. I know some people who write in the same room with other people. They share an office space, and there's sort of that social pressure on, we all have our eyes on you. You got to work, you got to produce, because we know if you're just goofing off. So I think that can be sort of a powerful sort of motivator to get the work done. And if you get feedback, I think an intelligent read is really the best thing as a writer you can get when you're working on something in progress. I've had my wife, and I've had editors. I'm quite proud. Like I don't like the idea of people reading stuff before I think it's sort of like basically okay. So I tend to hold on to stuff maybe longer than other writers do. I know other writers who are much more like chapter by chapter, getting feedback from their editors and stuff. And I don't want to do that because I feel like that's sort of my job. And so I like sort of presenting them with something that's basically close to what the finished product will be. But I think it's a personal thing. Like if it works for you, like I would jump on it. Because writing is very solitary. It's nice to have some company.
Where were we? Mr. Kenneth Oppel, thank you very much for coming.
You're very
out.
welcome.